In the Sichos of the Rebbe Rashab, Torah Shalom, the famous Sichos of the Rebbe Rashab, there are, of course, many very meaningful, interesting, and powerful, and on occasion controversial statements made by the Rebbe Rashab. One of them is, and I don't recollect if he's saying it in his own accord or he's quoting somebody who said that the Alter Rebbe wrote and published the Tanya in Tov Kuf Nun Zayin, 1796-7. And then he said, Oib Chas v'Sholem, es wird geschrieben geworden in der Oib von Tov Kuf Lamed Zayin. And then he added, parenthetically, Memeg of dem sagen Chas v'Sholem, wird die Tanya gebrennt Welt, und das ist nicht die Kavone. In translation, this means, the Rebbe Rashab said, the Tanya was published in 1796 or 7. Had the Tanya been written and published 20 years before, in 1776 or 7, it would have burnt the world, and that is not the purpose. The purpose is not to burn the world. What is the purpose? The purpose is to transform the world. There's a very big difference between overwhelming something with something higher and transforming something through a process of engagement and involvement. It reminds me of the meeting that took place between the Alter Rebbe and the Baruch of Mezhebush. Baruch Mezhebush, as you know, I'm sure, was the grandson of the Heilige Baal Shem Tov, and he had a claim. For the Heavy and Pekida B'Goy Tzadikaya. I wish to be the pocket, the overseer, the one in charge of all the tzaddikim. He was the Baal Shem Tov's grandson from his mother, and he felt that he was therefore the legitimate heir of Chassidus, and he believed that he had the authority to not just choose a path for himself, but to choose a path and avoid all the other tzaddikim. And he had huge, very famous disputes with Rabbi Nachman Braslever, who was his nephew, and of course with Alter Rebbe, amongst others. And there was a showdown, there was a meeting that took place in 1805, which was very powerful. And the Alter Rebbe actually wrote down minutes of that meeting and disseminated it, publicized it, because the Baruch Mezhebush's Talmidim had published an alternative version of what had happened, and the Alter Rebbe felt that he had an obligation to clear the air. And one of the points described in this letter which the Alter Rebbe wrote, describing his meeting with the Holy Rebbe, the Baruch of Mezhebush, was that the Baruch of Mezhebush asked him why he allowed himself to be taken to Peterburg, why did he allow himself to be arrested and put in jail and spend 53 agonizing days, and then the 54th day, as we all know, why didn't he avoid all of that? And he used the expression, "Dos gekentos alza rübergehen behavoras hayad ala metzach." You could have achieved all this by simply running your hand across your forehead, and you would have eliminated all of your tzaddis. Why did you permit yourself to go to jail and to go through all of that suffering? You could have avoided simply by running your hand across your forehead. And of course, the Alter Rebbe did not respond, and the Alter Rebbe naturally knew what the Baruch Mezhebush had told him, but the Alter Rebbe had undertaken to go to jail because of the need, as the expression is, durch zu gehen the Welt, not to circumvent or to be above the world, but to actually affect it by traveling through it. And in order to affect this, the Alter Rebbe needed to go to jail. There was no other way to achieve it. But the Baruch Mezhebush disagreed. He said, no, you run your hand across your forehead and all problems are solved. Why do you have to go through these struggles? And in context, I'm reminded of yet another story, which is printed in Meir Aftzin Sefer, Eides Ba'afela. The story may appear someplace else, but this is where I read it, that Reb Chache Fagin repeated the following to the Bochrim when he returned from seeing the Frierdiker Rebbe in the summer of 1927, Bei Zion. When the Frierdiker was let go from prison, Yud Beis Tammuz, Yud Gimel Tammuz, that year, 1927, he quickly discovered that he wasn't free. He was still a prisoner, but he was a prisoner inversely, indirectly, backwards. They made him the only free man in all of Russia, and all of Russia was in one huge jail, which meant to say that any person who approached the Frierdiker Rebbe was immediately punished. So people couldn't come to see him. The Rebbe was cut off from his followers, and if he's cut off from his followers, the work cannot be done. And that's really the reason why he chose to leave Russia. He concluded that he'll be better able to serve the purpose by not being in Russia, where Hasidim could be reduced to a system of individual cells of Hasidim operating independently from one another, as opposed to there being a center represented by the Rebbe. But during that summer, the Rebbe isolated himself, and he didn't want anybody to come to see him except for a handful of people. And he spent that summer agonizing over what to do, until he realized that he needs to leave Russia. Then he traveled to his father's tzin in Rostov. Then he returned to Petersburg. He spent a very, very excited tissue with Chassidim, and right after Simchas Torah Peches, he left. Reb Chatzah Fagin, who was the head of the yeshiva at the time, was one of the few people who had access to the Rebbe. When he came to the Rebbe told him a very interesting and powerful story. The story he told him was that during the lifetime of the Holy Maggid of Mezritch, there was a kitrug against the Mezritcher Maggid, similar to the kitrug against the Alter Rebbe during his times. In other words, the Mezritcher Maggid was supposed to go to jail. Why didn't he go to jail? So the Rebbe Rayatz, the Frierdiker Rebbe, said to Reb Chatzah, because Reb Zusha Hanepola found out about it. The great tzaddik Reb Zusha Hanepola heard about it, Lamaila, on high, and he said, Rebbeinu Shalom Zusha will nicht. Master of the world, Zusha doesn't agree. And Reb Zusha had a koyach that if he didn't want to go to jail, if he didn't want someone to go to jail, he didn't go to jail. So the Reb Zusha Hanepola said, Rebbeinu Shalom Zusha will nicht, the Magi did not go to jail. Of course, the Alter Rebbe went to jail, and you had the story with Reb Shmuel Munkes, where he consulted with him, and Reb Shmuel Munkes told him, Bist du a Rebbe, vete ken kill nit shatten. If you're a Rebbe, no bullet will hurt you, and so forth. So the Frierdiker Rebbe tells this to Reb Chatzah Fagin, that Reb Zusha Hanepola didn't want the Mezritcher Maggid to go to jail, so he said, Rebbeinu Shalom Zusha will nicht, Zusha doesn't want, and the Maggid never went to jail. So Reb Chatzah Fagin says to the Frierdiker Rebbe, "News all the Rebbe does, all the Rebbe should do is the same thing. The Rebbe should say the Rebbe doesn't want." And of course, Tzaddik Gezer HaKadosh Baruch Hu Makayim, the Gemara says, the Tzaddik decrees and Hashem fulfills it, or HaKadosh Baruch Hu Gezer Tzaddik Mevatel, Hashem makes a decree and the Tzaddik breaks it, and you want us to go to jail. And the way the story is written was there was no response. Frierdiker Rebbe didn't say anything, which meant to say that he wasn't prepared to do what he himself had proposed to the Reb Chatzah Fagin. And of course, the idea is that the Frierdiker Rebbe, like the Alter Rebbe, understood that there's a bitter here, there's a reason to go through these struggles. It isn't simply suffering, there's a purpose. If you want to, as the expression is in Yiddish, Durach gehen de Welt, or a Rebbe gehen de Welt, to go through or to navigate in the world properly, to be able to influence it without being influenced, you have no choice but to go through all of the things that you need to go through. Otherwise, it simply doesn't occur. But having given you this background, you now understand that there are two concepts in the world of tzaddikim, and the world of big tzaddikim. And of course, you and I are in either category. The biggest tzaddikim have a koyach to go through the world in a category, on a level which we would call, for lack of words, brennen de Welt, destroy the world. To me, the world doesn't exist. Another category of tzaddik would go through the very same world, but instead of, in quotes, destroying the world because of the incompatibility between the world and Torah, you're mevader, you bring correction, you bring transformation to the world. You make the world be raised up. These are two different approaches. The first approach is a makif approach, is an indirect approach, just a powerful force that changes the world indirectly. And the second approach is a more pneumius approach, a more internal approach, a more delicate approach, a more involved approach. And there are many stories that reflect both. Let me give you a timely example. Right? We're coming now from Chanukah, we're coming from Didan Notzach, Hey Teves, Chamisha B'Teves. We're at the verge of Yud Beis Teves, which is the end of the Shivas Miyam Elohim, the Rebbe writes in a letter, and so forth. Hey Teves has the slogan Didan Notzach. Didan Notzach is an expression which the Rebbe did not invent. All the Rabbeim use the expression Didan Notzach. You have it in Torah Sholem, the Alter Rebbe's quote having said Didan Notzach. Didan Notzach means we will be victorious. So during the Parshas HaSfarim, the Rebbe told a medrash, where the medrash tells the story of Didan Notzach, that there was a town, and near the town there was a body of water, a river or a lake, and it became known to them that in this body of water there was a demon, a spirit of Mayim, a spirit of water, which is the worst kind of shadim. And the Yidden came to the Tana that was there and said, what are we supposed to do? There is an evil force in our water. So he said, take sticks, go down to the river, pound on the water and scream, Didan Notzach. So they went down to the whole community, went down to the water. They pounded on the water with sticks and they screamed, Didan Notzach. And then they saw a little blood on the surface of the water. This was an indication of the death of this spirit Hamayim, and life went back to normal. Now, the Rebbe, when he told the story, explained the story somewhat. But what kind of avodah is this? You go down to the water, you scream Didan Notzach, you pound your sticks against the water, when you see blood, okay, the shade is dead. I don't know what kind of an avodah it is. But what I know what kind of avodah it's not. It's not pnimius. This is not transformative. This doesn't make you into a new person. This is not about growth. This is just about, boogieing away the boogie monster, frightening away the frightening spirit or presence. It's a story, it's Torah, it's true, but everything about the story reflects makifim, noise, makif, screaming, pounding. There's no transformation that's transpiring here. And evidently, in the case of that story, that was what the hour called for, the Danotzach. This kind of shouting, this kind of makif. Another story, also in the same framework, is a story with Rabbi Yamin Kletzker and Rabbi Shlomo Karliner. It's a long story with many details. The bottom line is that Rabbi Yamin Kletzker was sent by the Alter Rebbe to accompany Rabbi Shlomo Karliner on a trip away from Lozhne home after there was a meeting in Lozhne, which was quite controversial. There's some stories about that meeting also in some other places and so forth. And when Shlomo Karliner left the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Yamin Kletzker was sent along to accompany him. I think it was Rabbi Yamin Kletzker. And Shlomo Karliner realized how holy and how great this chassid was. And he was jealous of the fact that Alter Rebbe is such great chassidim. So Rabbi Shlomo Karliner displayed, he showed off. He was a tzaddik gomer, a tzaddik elyon. And he did all kinds of things to reveal to Rabbi Yamin Kletzker his incredible koiches. They traveled very quickly to find water so he can daven mincha. All kinds of things. At the end of, so to speak, his display, his showing off to Rabbi Yamin Kletzker about his koiches, he says to Rabbi Yamin Kletzker, I want to give you an offer. If you will join me and collect a following of people on your level that will join me, I will teach you everything. I'll teach you the secrets of Kabbalah, I'll teach you the language of the birds and the palm trees and all the mysteries, and you'll know everything. So the famous quote is one of the most famous quotes of Chabad, that Yamin Kletzker didn't know what to do. Shlomo Karliner was a big tzaddik. You don't want to mess with him. And that's really simply, literally true. On the other hand, Rabbi Shlomo Karliner is not his Rebbe. And Rabbi Shlomo Karliner's derech is not his derech. Rabbi Shlomo Karliner's approach. So he spoke in Russian and in code. And he said, in effect, I'm just telling you the translation, the master is a master, but he isn't mine. The servant is a servant, but he isn't yours. In other words, he acknowledged the greatness and the holiness of Rabbi Shlomo Karliner, but he told him, you're a Rebbe, I'm a chassid, but I'm not your chassid. And of course, the idea is that Rabbi Yamin Kletzker, in his pnimius, in his depth, needed a Rebbe like the Alter Rebbe, who would be involved in depth, as opposed to being involved in more peripheral things, and more makiftika things, more indirect kinds of influence. And I'll tell you a controversial story, and I hope I don't regret it, but I'll tell you the story. Also with the same Rabbi Shlomo Karliner, Kach Shamaiti, that Rabbi Shlomo Karliner once came to a shtetl, where there were many Chassidim. Some were Chabad, the Alter Rebbe's Chassidim, Lozhne Chassidim, and some were Karlin. Karlin was really the only other big Chassidus in Russia at the time, so obviously there was competition. So Rabbi Shlomo Karliner came to town, all the Chassidim of Karlin ran to the mikveh. It was at night. The mikveh was a river, which was freezing cold. So what they had was these huge, huge pots that you would boil up with huge quantities of water, throw the boiling water into the cold lake or river, and jump right in. And when you jumped in, it was still manageable. The water wasn't that hot, because you had just literally thrown the hot water in, and within a few seconds you had to boil up another pot. So the Karliner Chassidim run down to the mikveh, and they cook up a pot of boiling water, they throw it into the water, and they hear a deep cry of pain. Nebuch was a person in the water, and they basically cooked him with boiling water. They schlepped this man out of the water, and he was a bar minan. He had moved back to another station, as it were. Went back to see his maker. The Kalina Chassidim didn't know what to do. Here they were. They had come to the mikveh in honor of their Rebbe. And they wanted to toivel, and a man died. So they pulled this guy out of the water. They wrapped him in blankets. They ran to the Achsanya. They ran to the place where Reb Shlomo Kalina was spending the night, or the visit. They knocked on the door. Reb Shlomo Kalina opened the door, and they put this barman on down and left. Reb Shlomo Kalina sees what's going on. Someone had died. And evidently he understood why he person had died, so he felt some kind of an obligation. So he did whatever he did. Whatever he did, I don't know, and I can't imagine, and I cannot do, obviously. And he brought the man back from the dead. Kipshute. He brought him back to life. Now, Tchias HaMesim is serious business. Bringing somebody back who's passed away is not a game. Problem was, he was a chassid of the Alter Rebbe's. Now, what do you do if someone saves your life and you're not on his team, huh? You join his team, you switch loyalties. So here is this man standing at the door of Shlomo Kalina's Achsanya, thinking to himself, I am so indebted. I am so indebted. He saved my life. But I'm not his chassid. So he stood there for a while, and he thought for a while. And then finally he says to Shlomo Kalina, the Shlomo is a big tzaddik. He can bring people back from the dead. But the Rebbe is in Lozhna. The Rebbe is in Lozhna by the Alter Rebbe. And he opened up the door and he ran away. He ran away before the Shlomo Kalina could be makpid. Now, what is the meaning of this story? What's the point of this story? Why would somebody do this? And of course, the short answer to this question is, I don't know. The involved answer to this question has to do with the nature of the relationship between a chassid and a Rebbe. It isn't just that the Rebbe is holy and powerful and can do great things and perform great miracles, but that the chassid and the Rebbe are deeply connected. And the deep connection between the chassid and the Rebbe, which we call in our culture hiskashrus, is binding not just from the chassid to the Rebbe, but from the Rebbe to Chassidim. You know, we all know the story the Rebbe told in the first Maamar, where the middle Rebbe rolls up a sleeve, and he shows a young chassid, Tzafa der Malatzman. His hand is shriveled, and he says to him, Das ist alles von deiner Chan. Imagine a Rebbe saying to a chassid, you see him physically ill, it's your sins. I mean, besides for the fact that it must be very uncomfortable to discover that there's a tzaddik who's physically suffering because of somebody else's sins. But what the story demonstrates above all else is the depth of the connection, his kashas. This Rebbe, the middle Rebbe, was so connected to his Chassidim, he was physically affected by their deficiencies. And of course, you have to presume also, he was physically affected also by their great deeds, the good they did, and so forth and so on. It's a deep connection. So this Chassid wanted to inform Reb Shlomo Kalina, I'm not questioning your tzidkes, but the Rebbe, that means the pnimius dekakasha, the deep inner bond that exists between a Chassid and a Rebbe, that's not you. And it's certainly not you for me. You know, in line and kind, I'm thinking of stories as I talk. There's the famous story, maybe it's not so famous, but I've told it to you before, of the Moshe Lekoshnitzer and the Chassidishe Parsha. The first Ger Rebbe was the Chassidishe Parsha, B'Shemaya. He was a Talmud of Moshe Lekoshnitzer. That means the son of Yisrael Koshnitzer, the Koshnitzer Maggid. And it's a long story with many details. The bottom line of the story was that the first Ger Rebbe was there once when Misnagdim came and asked Rabbi Lekoshnitzer questions, because they wanted to show that he's an Amoritz, Kenish Lenin, because he was one of those tzaddikim who kept his lumdus a secret. So the Chassidishe Parsha was there, Shemaya Varsha, they called him in those days, Shemaya from Varsha, and he answered the Misnagdim so well that he completely quieted them and they left. When they left, Rabbi Lekoshnitzer says to his great Talmud, the Chassidishe Parsha gave me life. It's a kisht. I would like to kiss you all over for the good that you did for me. So the Chassidishe Parsha said, Ich darf nicht haben a Rebbe was kusht mir. Ich darf haben a Rebbe was reißt für mich Sticker. I don't need a Rebbe who kisses me, I need a Rebbe who rips pieces of my flesh. He left Koznitz, went to the Kotzker Rebbe, the Mendele Kotzker, and never came back. And there's a long continuation to this story which we're not getting into for more reasons than one. But here again, the message of this story is a chassid wants a deep connection to his Rebbe, as opposed to a peripheral, loud, external connection to his Rebbe. Or to use a classic form, there's higher and deeper. Makif, a Rebbe who does miracles and showers his chassidim with possibilities, is higher. But deeper is the Rebbe whose involvement with chassidim is on the chassidim's level, pnimius, depth. And I'll tell you some stories in kind, tell you some stories in that spirit. Number one, and I forgot where I saw this story, could be in Yudel Chitrik's Maises, that the Mizritcher Magid had a seder, that each one of his Talmidim took turns being a Mesharist, being his assistant, helping him. The Alter Rebbe had undertaken to be a Mesharist of the Magid Be'emes, to be a true Mesharist of his Rebbe the Magid. And he said to himself, the meaning of the word Mesharist is that Lo Yomish Mitayach Oyel, he's always together with his Rebbe. So he literally shadowed the Holy Magid. It was Hashan and Rabbi, I believe, and they were sitting in the sukkah. And suddenly the Magid says to the Alter Rebbe to lock the door to the sukkah so nobody can come in. And then he tells him, Du soll sein, bepnimius und nicht bemakif, bis yashvus und nicht behispoilus. The Rebbe kommt. Be internal rather than external. You should be calm rather than responsive, reactionary. The Rebbe is coming. And the Alter Rebbe saw the Baal Shem Tov for the first time while he was awake. What does this mean? He's saying you're going to connect to something real. Connect for real. To connect for real, you cannot react and get excited. Allow it to enter you. Allow for the depth to fill you. You know, and it's also reminiscent of the story that happened in the moments prior to the Rebbe Nishma Seiden's Histalkus, right before the Rebbe Rashab passes away. The Frierdiker Rebbe, his son, is standing at his bedside, and Berel Rivkin describes in graphic detail the terror of that night, the pain, the fear, the desperation, the helplessness. He says at one point during the night, the Frierdiker Rebbe walked out of the room where his father was laying, and he grabbed me, says Berel Rivkin, was a young bocher, and he shook me, and he says, Berel, we have hearts of stone. Look what's happening, we don't feel, we don't see. But during the course of that night, the Rebbe Rayatz became hysterical. He was standing by his father's bedside. This was mamish hours before his father was nostalgic. And he started screaming, Tate, Tate, Father, Father. The Rebbe Rashab opened his eyes, looked at his son, and said, his spoilus, moichin, moichin. Now, of course, I wasn't there, so I don't know the trup. I don't know how it sounded, but that's the story as it's recorded. Responsiveness, reaction, passion, mind, depth. Which means, in other words, the Rebbe says to his son, you can't afford to react emotionally. You've got to stay collected and in control and focused. And the Frierdiker Rebbe would say that, by the way, those are the last words he heard from his father's mouth. The Rebbe Rashab smiled and closed his eyes, and later that night he was nostalgic. Now, the meaning of this story is that there is a concept of excitability and excitement and responsiveness, but then there's pnimius, depth. And that's not as high, it's not as loud, not as demonstrative, not as passionate, but it more than makes up for its lack of passion with its depth, with its integrity. And finally, just to tell you a story close to us, which is wonderful to tell, even though perhaps people don't realize the significance of the story, is the following. The previous Rebbe came to America. 15 months later, his son-in-law, the Rebbe, came to America. And the Rebbe put him in charge, the Frierdiker Rebbe put the Rebbe in charge of what was called the Tzor Sforim Kahas, the Chassidic publishing house, the printing of Chassidus. And he set up a whole system. You know, Kovith Shoshelas Hoyer, Heichal Rishon, Sha'ar Rishon, Heichal Sheni. Every Rebbe has a different palace, and every palace has a number of different gates, Sha'ar Rishon, Sha'ar Sheni. And the Rebbe, of course, was Heichal Chi, the ninth Heichal. But B'chai from Frierdiker Rebbe, he wasn't the Rebbe, Kvayachol. So when he published his Sfarim, he just published them with his name. Harav, his first name, Schneur. Now, one of the many little details of the design of the Sfarim that cost printed in those years was a border. Every sefer had a different border. So the Rebbe is an our Rebbe, says to the Frierdiker Rebbe, what border should I use for myself? So the previous Rebbe tells him these words. Der Tate ist doch gewen apnimi. Und du bist doch apnimi. Nade dem Tatens Schar. My father was a man of great depth. Emes. You are a pnimi, a man of great depth and emes. Nade, I'm giving you my father's border, which is like the ultimate compliment, where the previous Rebbe gives his son-in-law his own father's inyan, saying you're a pnimi. Here we have this Maamar that amongst many other things, describes two types of tzaddikim. And as today's piece of the Maamar develops and unfolds, this idea is going to be further developed and pursued and analyzed. What separates one category of tzaddik from another category of tzaddik is the nature of their influence. One is called Nesiach, a king who shines a great light and has a powerful influence. But that's what it is, a great light and a powerful influence, an effect, a fire. The other is a shepherd. A shepherd provides. He gives the subjects, the people, the community what they need. It's not fire, it's not overwhelming, but it's something that they can process and internalize. And these are very, very distinct personalities. And naturally it has to do with their nature, it has to do with why the Eibishter created them and what's their mission, and so forth and so on. But what separates one from the next is one is defined by the potency of its presence, by its light. And the other is defined really more than anything else by the depth of their connection, like shepherd's connection to his flock. Why does our Maamar delve into these two kinds of tzaddikim? The tzaddik uses a great force to influence and affect from on high. And the tzaddik uses a far lesser force to influence in a much more direct way. Why is this raised? Because our Maamar is exploring the difference between Chanukah licht on the one hand and the light of the Menorah and the Beis HaMikdash on the other. And he made an argument that there were two candles. There's the candle of mitzvah, which of course is represented by the Menorah and the Beis HaMikdash. And there's the candle of Ner Neshama, of Jewish souls, which is represented by the Chanukah licht. What's the difference? The light of the Menorah and the Beis HaMikdash is a lower light than the light of the Chanukah Menorah. But light of the Menorah and the Beis HaMikdash connected in a revealed and an overt and in a direct way. The light of Chanukah is a much higher light, but it's an invisible light. It's a dark light. It's a light you don't see directly. Because it's so potent, its access is only indirect. And the Maamar wishes to propose that the difference between the Menorah and the Beis HaMikdash light, which is called Ner Mitzvah, the candle of mitzvah, and the Menorah of Chanukah, which is called Ner Neshama, the candle of the Neshama, which is also a conductor of divine light, but in a different way, is the difference between the tzaddik, whose connection is pneumistic, like a mitzvah, you internalize it, and the tzaddiks whose influence is indirect, from a higher light, from the light of Chanukah candles, from a very high source. And obviously, the idea of the Chanukah Menorah is to illuminate the darkness, to shine in the darkness. And consequently, the Chanukah Menorah and its light, Havaya Yagia Choshki, what's called in other Maimorim of Chanukah here in Torah Or, Havaya Delayela, Hashem, which is completely beyond normal and order, and Ishtalshalus, which can illuminate and transform darkness itself. But it does so not in so pnimius a fashion, not in such a connected and deep way, but in a overwhelming and indirect and transcendent way, from a transcendent place and level, and so forth and so on. And the Rebbe wants to use this concept to explain Beis Shammai. If you have a good memory, you remember that 4 classes ago, first class on this Maamar, we started literally with a few lines at the very outset of the Maamar, that wondered why Beis Shammai says that in the first day of Chanukah you light 8 lights, on the second day of Chanukah you light 7 lights, on the third day of Chanukah you light 6, and so forth, when Beis Hillel says 1, 2, 3, 4. And of course we don't paskin like Beis Shammai, we follow Beis Hillel, that you go after Yamam and Nichnosim. 1, 2, 3, as opposed to Yom Mayetzim 8, 7, 6. Now, the Rebbe has his siches, where he discusses what you call koyach and poil and so forth and so on. But what is the mysticism that justifies Beis Shammai's position? He doesn't discuss Beis Hillel really. Why does Beis Shammai say that you go down 8, 7, 6, 5? So the Gemara says, the Gemara in Masechta Shabbos says that the reason we go down is because it's Keparei HaChag, that's Pechetz V'Helech. Sukkos, which is a mitzvah in the Torah, they brought 70 cows, 70 oxen, which of course according to Chazal correspond to the 70 nations of the world, in an order of not 10 a day, 7 times 10 would be 70, but 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, and 7. 13, 12, 11, 10, and 8, and 7 is 70, but you diminished. 13 the first day, 12 the second, and so forth. So Beis Shammai correlates the Chanukah candles to the Parei HaChag, the Pechetz V'Helech, went down. What's the mysticism behind the idea that in the Beis HaMikdash they brought karbonos in an order of diminution against the well-known klal of Mailim B'Kodesh Ve'ein Meridin, you're supposed to go up and not down. So this Maimon is going to answer that question and explain this correlation. That when you're talking about a higher light, and why do you need a higher light? Because the light is not simply shining for the purpose of being internalized, but for, as the expression of the Rebbe Nishma brennen Welt, deal with klipa, deal with an enemy in a way that overwhelms. You put all of your force into the first bang, and you gradually diminish. The first day of Chanukah, the first day of Sukkot, you have 13 oxen, 13 cows, because it's the strongest force of klipa, which needs the highest kind of transcendent light or fire, which weakens it. And once the klipa has been weakened, the next day, 12 is enough, and the day after that, 11 is enough, and so forth and so on. Says Beis Shammai, Chanukah candles are the same idea. There's a klipa. The Chanukah candles, which burn at night and in the darkness and on the left side, and they go in the numeral of 8, are so powerful they shine even in the Holocaust and in the Gulag and in the Inquisition. It's very powerful candles, very high level of candles, but their effect is indirect. Their influence is not connection, but force, but power, but passion. Says Beis Shammai, start with 8. Deal with the klipa, if you will, with a great force, and then as the klipa weakens, diminish, like Sukkos. But nobody argues about Sukkos, because Sukkos is a pasuk in Chumash. Chanukah Beis Hillel disagrees, and says, no, the first day 7, the second day 8, the third day 9, the first day 1, the second day 2, the third day 3, and on the 8th day 8. Let's find out why. We're reading on page 8 in the Maamar, line 210. This explains what the Gemara says. The opinion of Beis Shammai is Yemrish and Madlik Shmoina. The first day you would light 8 candles. Mikan ve'elech, Pechetz V'Helech, and you go downwards from there. The time at the Beis Shammai, and the basis for this position is the Yalef mi Parei HaChag. He derives it from the other case in Torah where there was a diminishing from step to step, which is the cows or oxen brought on Sukkos. Shemrish and Makrev Yud Gimel, the first day they had 13. Mikan ve'elech, Pechetz V'Helech v'chuli, and then you went downwards from there. And Beis Hillel disagrees. Beis Hillel says, no, it's true that on Sukkot they had 13 and then 12 and then 11 and 10, 9, 8 and 7 cows or oxen, but not Chanukah. Yemrish and Madlik Echad, the first day you light 1. Mikan ve'elech, Meisa ve'helech v'chuli, and then you go forward from there. Now, what's interesting about this Maamar is that this Maamar is endeavoring to explain the opinion which is non-halachic. In other words, this Maamar is really explaining Beis Shammai, and Beis Hillel is being explained as an afterthought. And the Rabbi has on many occasions pointed out that Maimorei Chassidus are not halacha, they're Chassidus. And it's entirely reasonable and entirely common for Maimorei Chassidus to explore an opinion in Torah or a passage in prayer or something like that, which is not the halacha, or not our minhag, because Chassidus is not simply telling us what to do and what not to do, it's revealing the secrets of the Torah in all of its dimensions. And consequently, this Maamar explores why Beis Shammai wishes to compare Chanukah to Sukkos in diminishing, and Beis Hillel has an issue with it. And the Rabbi explains himself. Ki. Hine, the idea would be as follows. Inyan Parei Chag, the concept of the cows or oxen brought on Sukkot, to offset, to placate, to pacify the 70 nations of the world, who gam ken amshachas makif mal yedim, is also bringing down very lofty supernal lights. Ki Sukkot, who is galas makif? Sukkot reveals the highest lights. Now, of course, there's two ways of looking at Sukkot. One way of looking at Sukkot is that Sukkah is such a powerful light, it's beyond vessels, represented by a Sukkah which embraces and envelops and so forth. But the other side of that coin is that Sukkot is very powerful, but its power and its holiness is only enveloping, surrounding, overwhelming, and we're not able to internalize it. The internalization of Sukkot is, of course, Shmini Atzeres, but we're not going there now. Sukkot is a very powerful light. The Baal Shem Tov says that the roof and the walls of the Sukkah, which correspond to the Anan Yaakov, the clouds of glory, comes from the cloud of Ketores that the Kohen Gadol burnt in the Holy of Holies Yom Kippur. And in spite of that incredible potency, holiness, and highness, it remains makif and not pnimi. It remains indirect and not direct, embracing and not internally penetrating. With that, you have to wait for Shmini Atzeres, Itcha, and all those other wonderful things, Atzeres Tia Lochem, and all the rest. And Hashem Alekecha. But Sukkot is still makif. When Shgos, as the Pasuk says, Ki Gover Aleinu Chaste, that the kindness of Hashem is a level of Rav Chesed, or his Gabrus, beyond limitation. Infinite kindness, which makes even not good into good, but not in a transformative, deep way, but in an overwhelming, diluting kind of a way. And Vaideyam Shachazu, because you're bringing down such a lofty level of light, Mizbararim Gamkin, it brings clarity and order also to Ha'ayin Sodim, to the 70 supernal angels that correspond to the 70 nations. And they are transformed, to become bottled in this light. Which is why there's a special focus on Sukkot on the following pasuk of Hal Wasavaya Kol Gayim V'Gamer. All the nations of the world praise God because they recognize how the Beis HaMikdash and the avoid in the Beis HaMikdash benefits them. Ki go varaleinu chasdei, there is so much chesed brought upon the Jewish people that it spills over lahavdil to the non-Jews, and the whole world benefits from the Beis HaMikdash and the glory in the Beis HaMikdash and the light of the Beis HaMikdash. But the effect that this light has on the non-Jew is an overwhelming one, as opposed to the effect that it has on a Jew. It's supposed to be more pneumistic. We begin with 13 cows, which corresponds to the 13 attributes of mercy. Shehei makifim kenoida, they're very high lights that affect indirectly, as opposed to a more controlled light, a more streamlined light, a more focused light, which affects more pneumistic. But in the subsequent days, the light is diminished, the number of cows and oxen is made less. Since there was an initial clarity affected. Various aspects of the makif. Through the energies of the first day, it no longer is necessary to such a great level of light, like on the first day and so forth. So the reason you have such a powerful light on the first day, represented by the number 13, is because it's a powerful light of makif, Brennenwelt. But you diminish from there because it becomes unnecessary. So Beis Shammai said that Chanukah is the same. Chanukah is the same idea. Chanukah, they went to war. In a battle they could not win. And their Mesirus Nefesh drew from on high, and also from within themselves, an incredible power, which defeats Klippa through overwhelming, from a transcendent place. And Beis Shammai therefore argued that you have Bechinas Makif Manal, the indirect lights, the higher lights, which shine on Chanukah. Which pushes Klippas away. Says Beis Shammai, like Sukkot, put all of your power into the first punch, and then gradually diminish from there. Now, Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai both agree that that's what happens Sukkot. But when it comes to Chanukah, they don't agree. Beis Shammai says, do the same on Chanukah as on Sukkot, and Beis Hillel disagrees. And here's why. However, it's not a perfect parallel. Chanukah at the time of battle. So it says in the Hallel, Savuni b'shem avai ki amila v'geimed, that the enemies are surrounding me and I'm exhausted from the struggles. V'hainu gam ken adi amakifim dafke, that the way Chanukah and the story of Chanukah defeats the opposition through an indirect light. And only this higher light is able to defeat the enemy. But it's a struggle. Like it says also in Hallel, and there's a Maamar from Alter Rebbe which we learned earlier this year, which explains this pasuk. Tevlacha says b'havaya, it's preferred to shield yourself from havaya, which in the Maamar is interpreted to be havaya d'li'ela, godliness beyond the shtalshalos, mipteach ba'adam, from trusting in Adam ma'elyon, k'moshe kasav b'makam achar. So Chanukah, like Sukkot, is a very high light which pushes aside evil. However, on Sukkot it's more peaceful, as you'll see momentarily, and Chanukah it's through a struggle. Sukkot, on Sukkot, since Sukkot has its koyach from the Torah, there's no struggle. When Sukkot comes, and we bring the 70 oxen, beginning with 13, going down towards 7, the koyach of the Torah, which inspires this makif effect, that the influence on goyim and goyishkeit is automatic, and by itself. But Chanukah is different. Chanukah is a derabbanan, and it requires a struggle. Now, of course, so what's higher? The makifim of Sukkot, the makifim of Chanukah? And the correct answer is, it depends. In one way, this is higher, in one way, this is higher. But what's relevant to us is that although Chanukah and Sukkot can be compared because of the transcendent light, they cannot be compared in the nature of the effect. On Sukkot it's automatic, and on Chanukah it's through a war. Beishamai argues, since both share this principle of a higher transcendent light which breaks, as opposed to a more controlled pneumiastic light which transforms. And in both cases, the way this is achieved, that a powerful light defeats klipa, al kain lamedim Beishamai. Thus, Beishamai wished to compare to say, just like the cows of Sukkot go down, so should be the candles of Chanukah. You start off with the greatest of powerful lights, and you gradually diminish for the same reason of how it is by the cows of Sukkot. This is Beishamai's opinion. But Beis Hillel says, I'm sorry, Beishamai. On Sukkot I agree, because on Sukkot it comes from the koyach HaTeirah, which although it's a makif that affects and transforms peacefully. But Chanukah, it's through a struggle. And if it's through a struggle, you can't afford to do it this way, because struggles are complicated. And therefore, Beis Hillel Savri, although Beis Hillel agrees with Beishamai what's happening on Chanukah, it disagrees about how it should be affected. Pirush, in other words, you cannot compare Chanukah to the oxen of Sukkot. The rice of Sukkot is a biblical mitzvah. Comes from Chochmah. From the top down, and here again, Chochmah reveals a great powerful light. Is that good or bad? The answer is it's good, but it's lower. Consequently, the light of Teresh B'Ksav, including the light of Sukkot, is drawn down in and of itself from the top down. And as a result, even when the highest lights associated with Teresh B'Ksav make their appearance, it comes and shines initially. If there is no opposition, who holds back. Lahavaya is Baruch Shmei to God Almighty. V'yadavaya Tiksa is Hashem incapable of doing anything. He can do whatever He wishes. And therefore on Sukkot, since it's the Eibishter's mitzvah and the Eibishter's light, it affects the klipas from this powerful position of transcendence. Initially very strong, and then it's diminished. Mash'enk in line 226 Chanukah as opposed to Chanukah. Shehu midrabanan, which is also the same basic idea of a powerful light that shines from above, but it's midrabanan, it's rabbinic. Sheheimim shichuli as Gilizad, that the Yidden brought this energy and possibility forward. Vim Canaan, as a result, kivan shemamshichem zelamata. Since Yidden have to achieve this, and it's not happening by itself, if shelahagia lahamshich, It's not that Chanukah doesn't want to do what Sukkot does, it cannot. A Yid doesn't have the koyach from the very first day to bring this great potent light down initially. Step by step. In other words, if Chanukah had the koyach, that we could bring down this incredibly potent light like Sukkot, we would also go from the top down, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. But because people have to arouse this light, and therefore you have to struggle to bring it out, it has to be kimiyat miyat, slowly but surely. First there's only one candle, then you go higher in holiness, we continue to increase in light. And in the next two paragraphs, which are both in a parenthesis, which I'm presuming are Hagah from Tzemach Tzedek, he would compare Sukkot to Pesach and Chanukah to Sfiras Omer, where Sfiras Omer goes 1, 2, 3, not 49, 48, 47, for the same reason. And he would compare Shavuos to what happens after you have both Makif. The Makif of Sukkot, which is like Pesach, the Makif of Chanukah, which is like Sfiras Omer, then you're a Keli for the highest, deepest lights, which is the idea of Matan Torah and Shavuos. And move forward, please, to line 247. So I gave you an introduction about two types of tzaddikim. Both of these types of tzaddikim affect the world. One affects the tzaddik by his presence, and the other affects the world by his hashpah, by what he gives. One is higher, the other is deeper. One is makif, one is more pneumistic. So bear with me as I tell you some more stories. And I have a suspicion you're not going to be too disappointed if I do this. First of all, a story I think I told you last week, that there were three tzaddikim. The B'dusha Hanapola, the Holy Badishever, and the Alter Rebbe. The B'dusha Hanapola didn't see any fault in a Jew. The Badishever saw faults and he blamed them on God. The Alter Rebbe saw faults and he taught people how to correct. So who's the biggest tzaddik? The B'dusha, the Badishever Rav, the Hilik Badishever Rav, or the Alter Rebbe? And of course the answer is there are different kinds of tzaddikim. The B'dusha Hanapola and even the Badishever were very holy people. And from their perspective of holiness, they saw the Jewish nation as holy. Alter Rebbe was just as holy, but he was a Rebbe. That means to say he had the capacity to connect the people where people were. So he didn't dazzle them with light. He didn't stand on a place where he saw only positive. He engaged with them and he transformed them. And as I've told you many times, that's what's so special about the Tanya, written by such a holy person. And all the Tanya talks about is the struggle with the Yetzer Hara. The Alter Rebbe's Sefer is not about holy lights making appearances on white clouds and transforming darkness into light. It's about the war. It's about the struggle. Pimius. To give you another example, and while I'm on the road to controversy, let me continue. In the Rebbe Hashimis, there's an allusion made, you have this in the Kutei Deburim as well, to Rabbanan Strashel, Rabbanan Alevi. He was a very, very big tzaddik. He was a Gaon. So the previous Rebbe uses the expression, Harav Gaon, Harav Kodesh, Harav Tzaddik, aber nicht Rebbe. He was holy, he was brilliant, and he was righteous. But he wasn't the Rebbe. The Rebbe was the middle Rebbe. In the Hashimis, there's a Sharfa Loshen, there's another expression, where it says, Wegen seine Chassidim hat den ganzen nicht getracht. Rabbanan Strashel was incapable of relating to his Chassidim in his Chassidim's world. He was so holy, he was so far removed. It takes a Rebbe, who's even holier, to be engaged with Chassidim on the level of the Chassidim. And Rabbanan Strashel, according to the accounts of our Chabad Rabbeim, was not such a person. I'll tell you a gewaldige word. I heard this from a Kotzker, so nobody can hold it against me. I heard it from a Gerech Chosed, that the Tzemach Tzedek made a comment about the Kotzker Rebbe, and the Kotzker Rebbe made a comment about the Tzemach Tzedek. And I think it illustrates this point quite clearly, quite powerfully. The Tzemach Tzedek said of the Kotzker Rebbe, the Mendel Kotzker, as a Hatan Hoga from Lifnei Matan Torah, that he behaved like his Torah has not been given yet. Great lights, great passion, great holiness, no world. The Kotzker Rebbe's comment about the Tzemach Tzedek was that the Mendel Lubavitcher, the Tzemach Tzedek was a Moerendiger Masmid. He loved to learn day and night. So he didn't have time for Rebbeische Geschäften, for holy things. Shabbos. So the Kotzker Rebbe commented about Mendel Lubavitch, that's what he would call him. He's a ganze Woche ist in the Lernen and Shabbos kommt der Prav. And the whole week he's studying Nigla Torah, like a regular Rosh Hashiva, like a Lamden. In Shabbos he becomes a Rebbe and he's busy doing holy things. These are two perspectives, you know. The Kotzker Rebbe was unbelievably holy, unbelievably great. Someone I know and trust told me that they said about him, he was a soraf, a stick fire. Oh, but the Welt hat kein Scheiches nicht gehabt. He was not involved. Tzemach Tzedek was also very holy, but he was a Rebbe. That means to say his connection was a much more pnimius type of connection. And you know, from controversy to controversy, the Rebbe Rashab's mother, Rebbe Tzedivke, once said that she has proof that her cousin, her nephew, the Kappas Rebbe is a bigger tzaddik than her son, the Rebbe Rashab. They were first cousins. And they had a different agreement, a disagreement. So the Rebbe Tzedivke commented that my nephew, Zalman Kappas, is a bigger tzaddik than my son, the Rebbe Rashab. What's her raya? He says they once met and they argued about askonos, they argued about public service. And Zalman Kappas said to his cousin that Rebbe Nishma as a site that was very frimer, time for you to become more religious. So the Rebbe Rashab answered his cousin as his zeit that was very kliger. It's time for you to get smarter. And the Rebbe Tzedivke commented and says, my son is getting more religious from day to day. So the Kapastas brach is being Makuyim. I don't see that my son's brach is being Makuyim in turn, in kind. Now, I'm telling this story, and believe me, I have no chas v'sholom intentions of heibach hakoved. But here again, what's the difference between frum and klug? You know, if it's heibach hatayli, you're not allowed to do it. If it's heibach hachochma, it's also tipshus. It's two kinds of people. The Rebbe Shlomo was very holy. The Rebbe Rashab used to say about himself, Ich verstehe allein nicht, was ich, wenn sei frum, efshe weil ich stamm von misnagdim. The Rebbe Rashab said this of himself. I don't know why I'm so far from, maybe because I have misnagdische roots. So the Rebbe Shlomo didn't lack for frumkeit. And the Kopasta says, your approach to Askonos Siburis is wrong, it's not frum enough. And the Rebbe Rashab said, your approach to Askonos Siburis is wrong, it's not smart enough. It wasn't a question of smart or not smart, frum or not frum. Of course it was smart, of course it was frum. But the Rebbe Nishma Seiden was worried about the connection. Connection to the world, and in connection to the world you need not just frumkeit, but klugkeit, klugschaft, wisdom, smarts. And these are two types of people. The holy person and the connected person. Now the connected person is not necessarily less holy, but holiness is less the focus. The focus is on this connection. And the language of Chassidus and Kabbalah is the difference between a nesich and a raya. A holy person whose holiness is personal, and a shepherd whose holiness is communal. Shepherds with a flock are bound to make mistakes. The mistakes, of course, are not in them, the mistakes are in the flock. But that connection leaves them open to that possibility. People whose entire identity is holiness and isolation don't have that challenge, don't have that issue, don't have that possibility. Let's read it. Having explained what Chanukah licht have in common with Sukkot, that both of them are this transcendent, powerful light. And we've also explained why Beis Shammai wants to compare them and Beis Hillel refuses to compare them. Let us revisit the two types of tzaddikim we discussed earlier in this Maamar that were meant to be the analogy, the mashal for these two groups. Says the Rebbe, there's no doubt that the shepherds, the shepherds, the tzaddikim who are in the category of a Rebbe, are higher than those tzaddikim whose identity is holy people. Because their connection to the subject is an internal, a direct connection. As opposed to these very holy people who also have a great influence on everybody else, but it's indirect, it's from their lofty perch. And the idea is, the shepherds have inner souls, deep souls, and this depth connects them to the Yebishter in a deeper way, but it connects them to their subjects in a deeper way as well. There's a Maamar which is printed in the back of Samach Gimel, which is called Lahavin Im Teiras Abal Shem Tev Emes Lomalin Es Galsa B'Deiras Erishenim. They used to call it Ksav Yadach Lo Yinei Lemi, the unknown Maamar, but now it's apparently attributed to the Rebbe Rashab from Samach Gimel. And it says there that with the Alter Rebbe, his chilu neshama is the tikkun. Started neshamas of tikkun. You decide what it means. But this is the concept of haraya, pnimius. They have deeper souls. While the princes, the kings, have souls that are indirect. Skip the parenthesis. But on the other side, these very holy people, whose influence on the world is less connected but more powerful, is they have a higher source. From the souls of shepherds. These holy people have souls from a higher world, but from a more peripheral level of the higher world. The shepherds have a deeper source, but from the lower level. It's the same language I used earlier. Higher and deeper. The Nesichim are higher, the Reim are deeper. In every world, you have the question of height and depth. And ultimately, a Raya is the real thing. A Rebbe is the most important thing. But the Chanukah licht, like Sukkot, is compared to the Makif, is compared to the Nesichim. The example for illustrating this is if you have very precious fruit, even their leaves, have an advantage of other fruit. It's very simple. If you have fruit which is worth $100, the leaves that protect it from the sun and from the elements is also worth a lot of money because it's protecting something which is so precious. While a cheap fruit, which is worth $1, may be less valuable than the leaf of that alternative fruit because it's only worth $1. That though leaves are indirect, they're a lower level. They have no taste. I feel like even like ordinary fruit, and they're simply the Maamar Gef Misayim Tasiyah. The Rebbe brings a medrash that olim goes on the people who protect the Talmidei Chacham and protect the fruits. Since these leaves are from a superior fruit, which is far more valuable than cheaper fruit, and consequently they can be more expensive than the other fruit. And alternatively, the lesser fruit has a distinction against the higher leaf, because there's some kind of a fruit. They have a taste and you can eat them as opposed to the leaves. Says the Rebbe, understanding the higher leaf versus the lower fruit will explain the difference between the higher tzaddikim and the lower raya. There's two types of souls. God-fearing, perfect souls like a korban that are incredibly holy and close to God, like Yishai ben David and Yishavi David and Kilov ben David and all the rest. Ben Yamin ben Yankim. They cannot teach Torah to anybody else. Alternatively, Yesh Neshamas are different kinds of souls. That is a Rebbe. That are Baalei Torah, they're masters of Torah. But they lack that level of perfection, wholeness, and peacefulness. Belishum Dave, without any aspect of lack of integrity. Kamei Neshamas are not like the first category of souls. And again, it's not necessarily their fault, it's their involvement with the subject which had this effect on them. V'hainu, in other words, the perfect and lofty souls, the soul comes from a much higher level, but their influence on the world is indirect. They lack the proficiency, the depth to lead. Their souls come from a hidden world, which is completely hidden away and concealed. They themselves are protected, but they cannot lead, they cannot be mashpia. In psychological terms, you have a person who's brilliant and less mature. You have a person who's not so intelligent, but he's much more mature. The maturity of the second, in a way, makes him more intelligent than the more intelligent first because of his lack of maturity. And similarly, this is the mile of Rayim over the Sikh. Still, these very, very lofty souls, they're not masters of Torah kol so much. Line 260, because they come from a much higher level, but an external, a peripheral aspect of that higher level. While Ubaile Teda, people who acquits at Teda. Of course, Teda is the epitome of depth. Hey, Mebachidis Pnimi came from a place of depth. Rakshay Mebachidis Pnimi is tacht in the depth of a lower level, which is Alma dis Gasya, the Alma dis Galia, pardon me, the revealed world. Lochainem bis Gal Zalamed V'chol are able to teach. So, the Rebbe is Mashpia Pnimius, and the Tzaddik is Mashpia Makef. I have a cute little story. I'm telling it just to tell a story. I heard it at a bris recently that a woman, an almana, gave birth to a son after the death of her husband. And a Hillel Parashah was nearby, and the Tzemach Tzedek was nearby, and she begged them to come to the bris. And they both came, I guess, in deference to her deceased husband. So the Moyel said to her, listen, you have so many prominent people here. Who are you going to give what honor? So she said, I'm going to give it a Hillel Sandik. And the Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek, brachas and kriyas Hashem, he'll give the brachas and he'll give the baby the name. Nobody questioned her, but after the bris, people said to her, the most distinguished honor at the bris is Sandik. Why did you give it to the Hillel Parashah and not to the Rebbe? She says, Poshet, because I know brachas that get my Rebbe. The brachas have to come from the Rebbe. So the Hillel could be Sandik. He can provide all the schools, the Sandik has a great influence on the child. But the brachas have to come from the Rebbe. The Pnimius has to come from some real deeper source. Line 262. This now explains these 8 princes or kings that are perfect souls, but have nothing to do with the world. Says that Rebbe Shashashim that their root is Mishmein Tikunim Marishenim Shebiyid Gimel Tikunim Duk. The first 8 of the 13 principles of mercy, attributes of mercy. I don't want to give you long lectures on the Gimel Midas HaRachmim for 2 reasons. A, it's not the time. B, I'm not qualified. There's a letter from the Rebbe written to Lange Stark to Rabbi Hirschel Fogelman, which I think is in the Likutei Sichos Chelik Ches, but it's also in Igris Kodesh, and Rabbi Fogelman published it in his book that he wrote a few years back. And from Fogelman from Worcester. And in that letter, the Rebbe brings 4 opinions about the Gimel Midas HaRachmim, what they are, based on the Gemara, the Tosfos. I think he brings the comment, a Pirush on the Rosh, that brings also opinions about what the Gimel Midas HaRachmim are. But we follow Shittas HaArizal. Shittas HaArizal about what the 13 principles of mercy are is that Ve'emes is the 7th. 6 on one side, 6 on the other, Ve'emes is the center. And it's very, very simple the way it works out. You don't count Hashem, you have Kel, Rachum, V'chanun, Erech, and Apayim are 2 midas, and Rav Chesed, that's 6. Then comes the Emes is 7. Then you have Noitzeh Chesed would be 8, La'alofim would be 9, Noisei Ovin would be 10, Noisei Pesha would be 11, Noisei Chata would be 12, and Vanak would be the 13th. So you have 6 and 6 and 1. Now apparently the first 6 are higher, and the lower second 6 are lower. The higher 6 are less connected to Hishtalshalus. The second 6 are more connected to Hishtalshalus, and Ve'emes, which is in the middle, is even higher than the first 6. That's the way it would work. In other words, I guess you would call it Moichal Golgalta and Radloa. The second 6 would be more Pnimiyas Dike Makifim. The first 6 would be Keser Shebekeser, more Makiv Dike Makifim, and the Ve'emes would be Pnimiyas HaMakiv, which is higher than both. But here he brings it a bit different, that you have the first 8. The first 8 would be the 6 plus Ve'emes plus Noitzeh Chesed. And he says that those 8 are all makif, less involved in the world, and they're the source of the Shmoin and Nesichi Adam, 8 for 8. We know this in a lot of Maamar Chassidus, they bring that Chochmah and Bina come from the last 6. How? Chochmah comes from Noitzeh Chesed, which is Mazal HaChes, and Bina comes from Venake, which is Mazal Yod Gimel. That's what's brought in Chassidus from Kabbalah. Now, in this Maimon, it's a little bit different. It says, and by the way, the reason it says Noitzeh Chesed, the source of Chochmah, because Noitzeh is Tziner, which means a pipe, a kli for Hamshach Pnimis. Here he says Chochmah comes from Alofim from the word Limud, Alefcha Chochmah. And Bina comes from Venake, he doesn't discuss here at all. Now, the fact that in so many Maimorim it says that Chokhmah comes from a Neitzer Chesed, and here it says La'alofim, I think it's not such a big kasha, because Neitzer Chesed, La'alofim, after all, do go together. The tziner for Chokhmah. But let's play dumb. Let's make believe we don't understand, okay? In this Maimer, the first 8, that means Keil, Racham, V'chana, Erech Apayim, Erech, Apayim, Rav Chesed, Ve'emes, which is the 7th, and Neitzer Chesed, the 8th, would be removed, and the remaining 5 have connection to Hishtalshlos. Says the Rebbe, I'll start from the beginning of the line, Valderech, so in Shmeinu Nusicha Yad, the 8 tzaddikim who are so holy and removed from the world, is Mishmeinu, Tikkunah Marishenim, Mishud Gimel, Tikkunah Dikin Darachampim. The first 8 of the 13 midas, of the 13 midas harachim, Shem Bechinas Makifim, which their relationship to the world is indirect. In other words, they're very high. The influence in the world is very powerful, but not deep. As opposed to the last 5 or 6 that are not as high, but have greater depth. Kitikun la'alofim, because in this maimer, the 9th tikkun, the 9th midah, which is la'alofim b'bechinas pnimi, is the beginning of internal light. Not so high, but much deeper. Ki la'alofim, hainu alef ha'chochma, alef ha'bina, he interprets that the word alofim, which means 2,000, 2 alefs, is the study of chochma, the study of bina. Like it says in Kabbalah, Shavah Yenkin Veis Mazal is the Arach Ampen Chochma Bina draw. From the 2 Mazals of Arach Ampen, he doesn't specify which, because in most Maimorim it's Mazla Chesed and Mazla Yud Gimel, which is Neitzer Chesed and V'naki. Here he wants to say that they're both Yenik from Mazal Tes, La'alofim. And V'tzara, of course, I don't know how to resolve this, but this is the facts, nevertheless. But V'yinik Yezui B'china said Pnimi, Chochma Bina's draw from Kesed is deep and internal. Like a shepherd that's directly involved with his flock in a very internal and sensitive way. Because Yisrael mefanesim b'chol yidin provide parnasa for lakus. And there's also the idea of ichlureim, where chayas eliki is brought down into the 2 friends, which goes in chochma and bina ava b'chol. You have ichlureim, shtu v'shikru deidim. Reim goes in chochma and bina, samach to samach reima, huvim, and shtu v'shikru deidim goes in zon malchus. And the Royim get their hashpah from higher than Ishtalshalus through the avodah of Yidden down here. You have to bring down a channel from the Chesed of Ein Sof into Chochmah and Bin. Aleph, which is why the letter Aleph, which is the beginning of the word Aleph, has a shape which corresponds to the principle of contraction and containment. Is Tmunasa, its shape is Yud Lamayla, Yud Lamata, and Vav, so Yud on top, Yud on bottom, and Vav in the middle. Since this Aleph represents bringing the godliness to an internal state, to a deeper state, rather than a higher state, it's tzarach requires a contraction. Aval Chesma also in the first 8 mazoles, the first 8 midas, which includes Neitzer Chesed, Shekei Dilim B'chinas La'alofim and B'chinas Makifim are a very high light, but what they have in height, they lack in depth. Umisham Sheiresh Chas Nesichi, which is the source of such tzaddikim. There's a lashon in Kisvei Arizal, Neshama Shal Yover Aleim Aparged. They're before the curtain. There's no tzimtzum. Vareim Lamaylim B'char B'chinas Areim. They have a much higher source than the shepherds, than the tzaddikim who are rebbes, connected to their flock. Shoshash B'chinas Chochma Bina, whose roots are only Chochma and Bina. Shein B'chinas Alaf Manal, which is a lower source but with greater depth. Came at the same time. The shepherds may be lower but deeper. They're higher but shallower. And this is why on Chanukah you have a question. On Chanukah, all of the oils in the base of Mikdash were made unclean. It affects a blemish, which touches even Chochma Bina, the highest spheres of Pnimius. And you need a light which is beyond any limitation. Beyond the limitations of Chochma to deal with the Klippa. So on Sukkot, this works. Ubesukes mamshichem gamkin gimel tekun diknas only being going upon v'cholu. Rakshe besukes nicht nai my days ememelayin son v'cholu. But because sukkah is the biblical commandment, the light that reaches the klippas affects them automatically. Chanukah is a derabbanan, so even though you're bringing down a higher light, you're still going to have to fight. And that's why Beis Hillel says you can't afford it. Then that's what the dispute between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is. In how many candles you light the first night and the second, as we discussed earlier. We're not going to repeat it again. So there's a connection between, the candle of mitzvah and the candle of neshama. Direct light and indirect light. Nesichim and royim. And the machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel about Chanukah. And the Rebbe concludes, there's another way of explaining the difference between the 7 shepherds and the 8 kings. The lower 7 meters all broke. Bina, which is the 8th heaven, is the place of freedom. Wine, which is preserved, that it shouldn't bring to drunkenness, it should bring to joy. The 7 shepherds come from the 7 levels where the Shvir Sakelim occurred. The 8 kings, the 8 perfect tzaddikim come from the 8th heaven. They have the power to push away the klip of Asher, which is pushed away through Al-Keach of Makif. But to truly transform, you don't need a tzaddik. To truly transform, you need to have a Rebbe. This is really the difference between, I think at least in part this is true, Chabad and Paltiel. In Paltiel you went to a Rebbe for inspiration. In Chabad you went to a Rebbe for guidance. Tell me what to do. A Rebbe leads. It leads not from his place, but from the place of his subjects. And I'll just tell you a personal thought. We're expecting Mashiach. What's going to be the most difficult thing to do when Mashiach comes? What's going to happen? Mashiach is going to come. It's going to be wonderful, right? What's going to be the challenge? I think the challenge will be a very simple thing. To do what he says. Not to be inspired, not to be excited, not to be aroused, not to be dancing in the streets. To do what he says. Because that's a roye, that's not nesich, that's pnimius. And in the world of Chassidus, that's the meaning of a chassid, like the Rebbe Rashab said, as Rebbe says, makusha to the peulas for Rebbe, to do what the Rebbe says. It's not dramatic, it's not exciting, it's not holy, it's real. It's real. And that's the deepest thing.